So Bolasir is the kingdom, right? I asked. Yes, Renv said. So, what's the name of the city we're going to? Yolk chuckled. It doesn't work that way with the elves of this kingdom. The whole thing is Bolasir. If I remember right, it's a tradition that dates back to their founding. That's right, Renv said. The first High Dragon ruler of Bolasir was notably terrible at names. Instead of admitting to this fault, she opted to name everything under her direct control Bolasir after herself. Even when her kingdom expanded, the new territories were renamed Bolasir. None of the rulers after Bolasir bothered to rename anything, and now everything that is part of the kingdom of Bolasir is simply known as Bolasir. Maybe high dragons are just bad at naming things, I joked. Everyone chuckled. It goes a bit beyond that, though, Renv said. Not only is everything Bolasir, there are no borders within the kingdom. Everything functions kind of like a big city. That explains why the fair folk like it so much, Nash muttered. Why? I asked. Because borders can be an issue with them, Yulk explained. Some types of fae and fairy get trapped within the imaginary lines that we mortals insist upon. The more people believe in the border, the harder it is for them to cross. Bolasir's a big kingdom, so they have plenty of room to roam and grow. I kind of feel for the ones who get trapped in a forest, only to have that forest get smaller and smaller as the towns and cities grow around them, Nash said. It's usually the meekest of the fair folk that end up in that kind of situation, too. What about Tits and Algebron? I'm not sure. Yulk scratched his chin. It could be that the road goes through their forest, and as such is part of it. Or maybe they're a type of fae that isn't restricted by the power of borders. According to the maps that we have seen, the deep wild forest does not extend over the road we were traveling when we encountered the fae. Yulk's second hypothesis is likely correct, Ten said. Yeah, you're probably right, I said to Yulk and Ten both. I sat back and watched our surroundings as we continued to the heart of Bolasir, where we would meet the High Dragon. I wonder what it'll look like. Will it look like a dinosaur with wings like the dragons in European folklore? Or will it resemble a snake like the dragons in Asia? Or will it look like something else entirely? Will it wake up and talk to me? Or will something else happen while we're looking at the dragon? I've been trying not to think about my dream. The thing that told me to go see the dragon, whether it's a god or not, gives me the creeps. It said there's a bunch of other things like it watching me, too. It's been hard not to think about that during bathroom breaks. Suddenly, it occurred to me that I had forgotten to tell Ten about my dream. I hadn't had a chance to tell Nash or Yulk yet, but I don't have that excuse with Ten. Maybe I just sort of assumed it already knew, since it's in my head and everything. 10. Do you know anything about gods? I asked it. Gods and religions are not part of my knowledge base. Why? When I used all my magic and passed out, I had some sort of dream. Except it wasn't really a dream, it was more like my mind had been transported to somewhere else entirely. Something that said it was a god brought me there. It said that Yulk's going to decline an invitation to see the High Dragon, and I shouldn't let that happen. When I was out, did you notice anything weird about my brain? There was a noticeable pause before Ten finally said, I did not. It appeared to me as if you were simply unconscious. Were there any indications of a wild dream or something? No. The brain activity that I observed wasn't indicative of dreaming. Isn't that odd? Yes, but your dream may simply be a false memory that you obtained upon awakening, likely as a way to cope with the trauma you had just experienced. If it is real, though, I would suggest a modicum of caution. We have little to no information about gods or their intentions, and it would not be wise to do as they demand blindly. You're probably right, but I'm still going to convince Yulk to see the High Dragon. Really? Yeah. Call it a hunch, but I feel like it was telling the truth this time. And if I can't trust my feelings, then I'm probably too far gone to be resisting it now, right? Ten went silent instead of laughing at my somewhat dark humor. I allowed myself a small smile before I noticed that the trees around us were getting larger and larger. The trunks were also getting wider. So wide it took an entire minute for us to pass one, and it wasn't long before the trees began to block the sun. We're here. Imlor said as the cart stopped. I looked around and noticed that we had stopped at a building that had been carved into a tree. It had a sign with a coin on it hanging above its door, probably indicating that it was some sort of trader. Further down the road were many other similar buildings, all with lights adorning them. The visual was surreal. "All right, let's deliver our letter," Nash said, climbing out of the cart. Yulk, Renv, and I followed suit, and Imlor waved happily at us as we started to walk away. Yulk and Nash were examining signs as we walked. It was like they were looking for a specific one. We walked past one with a plate on it, and Renv's stomach growled. "You're still following us?" Nash asked the dwarf. "Well, once you conclude your business here, I was thinking I can take you to my uncle's shop to see about a reward for saving my hide," Renv grinned. "Plus, I'm curious to see what you lot get up to. Do you know your way around?" "Nope. I live down south a ways and haven't been up here in over a year. I'm pretty sure my uncle upgraded to a bigger building recently, but I've got no clue where it is." "That's okay," Yulk said. He pointed at a building with a sign depicting a pen and paper, attached to a large stable with several Narcies. As we got closer, we could hear the ruckus of commerce taking place. Nash and Yulk entered the building first, and Renv held his hand out in a gesture indicating I should go first. I did so, and the smell of fresh ink and paper hit me like a ton of bricks, nearly making my eyes water. Inside the building were bookcases behind a counter, several desks, and many elves and gnomes rushing around. Most of them were wearing a uniform, light tan shorts and tunic with a green symbol of a pen on their breast, and I assumed they were employees of whatever business this is. Those that weren't in uniform weren't rushing around. They were waiting in line in front of the counter or sitting at one of the desks with an employee. The customers, I assume, would say something to the employee, then the employee would write. It took a few moments for me to realize that the customers were probably dictating letters or something. I glanced at Nash, remembering his illiteracy. He saw me glance at him and looked around, then gave me a harsh glare. I looked away, trying not to smile. He grumbled something as we took our place in line. "What is this place?" I asked Yulk. "It's a mail office. They offer dictating services, reading services, delivery services, and since they know where everything is, they can give good directions," he explained. "Which is why we're here." "Directions to the Regent?" "Correct. I haven't been here before, so I don't know where Regent Oakmore does business." "I thought you've been to Bolisir." "I have, but not this part of it. My business was with a certain sorcerer who built a tower in the forest, far away from any signs of civilization. She was much friendlier than you would expect from a hermit. This sorcerer you're talking about wouldn't happen to be old Myra the Eternal, would it?" Renva asked. "Yes, the very same. She taught me how to use healing magic," Yulk said with a smile. "It seems like forever ago. How do you know her?" "Old Myra's one of the healers I was talking about sharing your discovery with. She's one of Oakmore's advisors now. She'll probably be around here somewhere. I'll check when I ask for directions to my uncle." "How'd she end up advisor to a regent?" "She said it was because of the pests. Turns out, a tower in the wilderness occupied by just one person is a great place for bugs and rodents. One day she went into her cellar only to find a nest of giant rats, and she lost it. Demolished the whole tower then and there. She dug her savings out of the rubble and moved here. Didn't take long for Oakmore to offer her a job." "Why is she called the Eternal?" I asked, as we moved closer to the front of the line. "She's a vampire," Yulk and Renv said simultaneously. They looked at each other and chuckled. "Oh, how does a vampire get blood when they're living as a hermit?" "Delivery services," Yulk said. "There are plenty of people willing to sell their blood, and the vampires who prefer not to injure people are more than happy to pay for it. Enchanted iceboxes keep the blood from rotting during transit." "There are services like that?" I asked incredulously. "Vampires just sort of order from a catalog or what?" "I don't think the services offer specific blood types, but you'll find such a service in nearly every territory. Sometimes they're even endorsed by the local government. It wouldn't do to have your vampiric citizens feeding on your other citizens." I had more questions, but the person ahead of us finished their business and it was suddenly our turn at the counter. As we approached, I realized the bookcases had letters in them, and there were gnomes busy sorting those letters. A brunette elf smiled at us, and Yulk stepped forward. "How can I help you today?" she asked. "We need directions to Regent Oakmore's place of business," Yulk explained. "We have a delivery for him." She explained that all we had to do was follow the main road and look for a building with a sign that depicted a tree. The tree was apparently the symbol of Bolasir and marked government offices and officials. She was also kind enough to tell us that if we went further down the main road, we would find the sleeping dragon. She highly recommended taking a guided tour if we got the chance. "Thank you," Yulk said and stepped aside so Renv could have his turn at the counter. We waited for the dwarf to ascertain his uncle's location and then left the post office. As we walked down the main road, I wondered how things were going to unfold. I assume someone is going to invite us on the tour to see the dragon, and Yulk is going to decline this invitation. I'm going to have to somehow convince him to accept the invitation. That's going to be hard, because I still haven't had a chance to be alone with my brothers and explain my dream to them. "There it is," Nash said, pointing at a building. Most of the buildings were within hollowed-out tree trunks. This one, though, looked like it was made of very old stone. It reminded me of the kind of stone you see a castle made out of in a fantasy movie. There were also plenty of people on the road, but none of them seemed at all interested in going in or out of the building. The doors were made of metal, iron probably, and swung open surprisingly easy as we entered. The first thing I noticed within the building was the distinct smell of stale paper. Like the air within this building had been here for years and had been reading all the books. The room we had entered was smaller than I'd expected, and there were 8 doors, 3 on the walls to our left and right, and 2 on the wall behind the desk in the middle of the room. There were 2 people at this desk, a male and female elf. The female elf was sitting behind the desk with a serious expression on her face, and the male elf was standing off to the side reading some papers. Yulk and Nash approached the desk, and I followed them with Renv trailing me. "Excuse me, we're here to deliver a missive from High Chief Ulermak to Regent Oakmore." "Is he in?" Yulk asked politely. "That would be me," the male elf said with a laugh. "What a coincidence. I was just reading up on the situation with the Night Kingdom. May I see the missive?" "Here you are, Your Highness." Yulk passed the letter over. Regent Oakmore took the letter, opened it, and began to read. The woman sitting behind the desk watched the interaction, but was glancing at me every now and then. I smiled at her, and she froze for a moment, but smiled back and politely looked away. As I suspected. Strange happenings must be afoot for my blood brother to ask for reinforcements, Oakmore said after a moment. You know he once fought off one of these invasions single-handedly? Mima, make certain this missive gets to Field General Yom with the instruction that he take his soldiers to Ulermak's aid. Yes, Your Majesty. Also, she trailed off and subtly pointed at me. Oh, the human! Oakmore slid between Yulk and Nash with a speed that would shock lightning. He grabbed my hand and vigorously shook it a few times before saying, What a pleasure it is to have you visit the mighty kingdom of Bolasir. I've been simply dying of curiosity ever since I heard about the orcs discovering you. Ulermak says they found you in a dungeon, is that right? Yes, I managed to say despite my shock. Nash found me and Yulk revived me. Nash and Yulk? Oakmore asked. That would be us, sire, Nash answered, gesturing to himself and Yulk. Truthfully, why? That sly pupper managed to send me the whole set. Tell me, did the situation with the monster in the dungeon ever get resolved? Last I heard, Ulermak was sending over 20s. It did, Your Highness, Yulk said. Nick is the one who killed it, actually. Nick? Oakmore inquired with confusion before looking back to me. Oh, yes, of course. You must be Nick, then. Yes, sir, I said. It's simply wonderful to meet you. Please, accompany me to my office. I'd like to hear more about your adventures thus far. Nash and Yulk glanced at each other and shrugged slightly. It would be our pleasure, Your Highness, Yulk said. They're in Blurpus? I asked incredulously. Not Yerna? Great Chief Tormund nodded gravely. The graying orc in front of me had ridden night and day to bring me this news himself and beg my aid. Quite a feat for one of his advanced years, but he had done so to make certain that I would not decline his request. He had given of himself to ask me to do the same, and it would be the highest form of disrespect to ignore this. Of course, I had no intention of ignoring or declining his request. But the fact that he rode here himself suggests that he thinks otherwise, which means I need to make it clearer to my great chiefs that I stand with them. Their struggles are my struggles. This line of thought must have shown on my face because Tormund gave me a knowing look. Ulermach, I rode here myself because my narses are faster than the scouts and I don't trust anyone but myself and my son with my narses. Since I'm too old for the field, I sent him to lead and came here myself. Get out of my head, I grinned. I'll send the regulars and redirect our allies. How's your boy doing? He's had better days, I'm sure, Tormund sighed. Wants to be an artist, not a general. His paintings and sculptures are fine to look at, too. He really cares about his craft. The look on his face when I told him what was required of him was grim. He didn't argue it? No, Grum's a smart boy. He knows that if he doesn't take charge, there's a good chance that many of our people will lose their homes and their lives. He won't allow his aversion to responsibility cause our people to suffer. I'm glad to hear that. How's things on the front? They've captured a settlement and a village. Lofen must have finally sent a competent commander because they're using shield walls and pikes, and we haven't won a single skirmish. They won't pursue us either, so our traps and tricks have been ineffective. The best we've been able to do is convince them to pull back. The mention of shield walls made the hairs on the back of my neck raise. I had been hoping I was wrong about the vampires, but phalanxes are one of their favored formations. It could be a coincidence, but this, along with the fact that the drow aren't sticking to any of their patterns, is alarming. Tormund noted my silence and thoughtful expression. You don't think... His eyes went wide as he trailed off. It can't be the vampires, can it? How could they have infiltrated Lofen's inner circle? Tormund is old enough that he was raised on stories of his father fighting against the vampires of the Night Kingdom. He had even personally led the charge against the remnants that threatened our borders. Of all the great chiefs, he was uniquely qualified to know how dire a threat the vampires can be. I don't know, but it's not outside the realm of possibility, I said. Lofen's paranoid, but he's also an idiot. His criteria for choosing his generals is well known, and it wouldn't be hard to take advantage of that. But how can this be? Drow can't be turned, and there isn't a single non-Drow noble in the entirety of the Night Kingdom. Lofen's not stupid enough to make a vampire his general, right? I don't have answers. It could be that the Drow in question is simply working with the vampires, or it could be that Lofen couldn't find a general among his nobility and hired a mercenary. Regardless, something is definitely off about this invasion. Have there been any reports of vampires in the field? No, none at all. There's that at least, I said as I rubbed my chin. So either I'm wrong about my hunch that the vampires are at work here, or Lofen is unaware of the vampiric influence on this invasion. What if he's dead? Tormund asked. Can't be. One, I'd have heard about it. Lofen doesn't pay his staff well enough to keep their silence. Two, there's a functional drow army. The nobility of the Night Kingdom wouldn't be able to pull that off without Lofen. Those strings are too fragile for the vampires to be able to yank them. It's a mystery. Tormund sighed and leaned back in his chair. Still, doesn't change what must be done. Blurpus must be defended. What are we going to do about the shields? Shields won't help them if they attack your keep, but for the field we may want to look into mounted mages, I suggested. Or axes. Axes would probably be cheaper. They're using pikes and spears. The axes have trouble closing in. I like the idea of a mage cavalry, though. Yeah, but we don't really have the infrastructure for that sort of thing. The guilds might. They've got to know of some adventurers that can use magic and ride a narse. Sure, but it's going to be costly. Won't be a long-term solution to this kind of combat. Can't expect this to be a quick war. Tormund laughed. You should use that overly large head of yours to find a way to encourage mages to join the regulars. Then we wouldn't have to worry about this kind of thing. My head isn't overly large, old one. Yours is just small, I grinned. Then a thought occurred to me. Magic users like to study and learn. It helps them with their casting, maybe a school or something. charge tuition, and offer waivers for military service. The guilds would probably have an interest in that, might even be willing to pay extra taxes to help fund it. See? Big head, big ideas. Ray-Zun, I shouted, ignoring the jab from Tormin. Ray-Zun quickly popped his head through my door. Yes, High Chief? I need a meeting with the leaders of the adventurers' guilds and companies. If they want to continue operating in the unified chiefdoms, they'd better get here with speed. Ray-Zun nodded and closed the door. Tormin raised an eyebrow at me, then grinned. You'd ban them? He asked. Damn right, I replied. Most of them are tax dodgers anyway. All I've got to do is send the auditors and they're done. They're well aware of that. Tormin nodded and chuckled. The truth is, most of the guild leaders are respectful and will come when called regardless of whether or not I make threats. While it's true that the majority of them definitely do not pay their legally obligated share of taxes, they still understand their place in the world. A handful of them, though, do not. They keep forgetting that their wealth does not equate to status here in the unified chiefdoms, and in Kirkana especially. If I didn't threaten them, they would ignore me. This would force me to do some rather unsavory things to teach whoever replaces them not to repeat their mistakes. My father once told me that if I could avoid being cruel, then I should do so at all costs. Fear naturally follows respect, but respect does not follow fear. He generally knew what he was talking about in regards to governing, so it's advice that I heed. A school for magic, Tormin said thoughtfully. How long do you suppose it'll take to make? That depends almost entirely upon the mages, I replied. We've got some empty buildings that would do the trick. The Uli Trade Union building is what I'm thinking. The Uli finally gave up the ghost? Thought I'd never see the day. Yeah, they've been done for a while now. Thankfully, it was a slow decline, so it didn't hurt the economy too much when the boys shut the doors. The Uli Trade Union had been a multinational trade organization that began a long time ago. My great-grandfather had given the seal of approval for the construction of their gigantic office. A series of scandals and bad business decisions had started their decline during my father's time, and I had signed the paperwork that forgave their debts and closed their doors. What are the Uli boys up to these days? I don't know. Part of their debt forgiveness was the requirement that they forfeit their property and leave the chiefdom. They didn't tell me where they planned to go. Tormin slapped his knees. So, one more thing before I go. You met with the thing that they dragged out of that dungeon? Sure did, I grinned. He's a human. A human? What's that? Well, looks kind of like an elf, but with round ears and a few sharp teeth. Didn't really get a chance to talk to him very much because I had him deliver a missive to Bolasir to request aid against the Drow. The reports say he's from another world, and that world is full of humans like him. Oh, and he can eat meat and veg. Weird, Tormin frowned. You sent him to Bolasir by himself? He that strong? Guild says he's level 7 already, but no. I sent him along with Fleshcarver Yilda's boys, Nash and Yulk. She adopted the human, you know. No shit, Tormin laughed. Haven't heard from Yilda Alta in decades. Any word on how she's doing? From the sound of things, she's enjoying the quiet life. Can't begrudge her that, not after what she gave for it. Too true. So the human. Think he's dangerous? Probably, but not to us. He seems pretty amicable and level-headed. That's good to hear, Tormin said as he rose from his chair. So long as you've got some idea as to what you're doing with the human, I'm fine with whatever you decide. I should get back. I nodded solemnly as he turned to leave my office. He paused for a moment at the door. Should I accompany you? I asked, trying to guess the reason for his hesitation. He turned to look at me with a little bit of shock. I suppose I had guessed wrong, and it hadn't even occurred to him to ask. My prowess on the battlefield is well known, and even though Tormin and the rest of the great chiefs are big orcs, I tower over them. Tormin met my eyes, and then looked at the mountains of paperwork on my desk. I don't think so, Ulermak, he answered with a grin. Things are not quite so dire as to give you an excuse to get away from the paperwork. But there's just so much of it, though, I said with an exaggerated frown. Tormin and I laughed for a few moments before things settled down into a somber silence. When you enter the field of battle, it will be indicative of failure on our part, Tormin said. We'll do everything in our power to ensure you get to enjoy your paperwork. Goodbye, High Chief. Goodbye, Great Chief. Tormin left the room, and I sighed. I'd known Tormin since I was a child, and it pained me to see him as an elder now. The massive orc that had sparred with me and shocked me with his speed and power was now too old to even accompany his son into battle. Still, I felt a little beam of pride that he liked my idea for a magic school. Maybe we could do more than one and have the schools compete with each other to further motivate their students. No, I doubt there'll be any need for that. The knowledge of magic alone will be more than enough motivation for most of the students. Hell, maybe once things get going, I'll take a class or two. Find out if I could have been good at magic or not. My gaze fell back to my paperwork. Fuck, I whispered to myself as I picked up my pen. A knock on my office door saved me from the looming task at hand. Rezun poked his head into my office. Hi, Chief. 2 of the guild leaders are here to see you, he said. Which ones? I asked. Pumos and the Adventurers Guild. Send them in. No need for introductions. Rezun nodded and left the room. The Adventurers Guild and the Pumos Union were the 2 largest guilds in the unified chiefdoms. The Adventurers Guild was much larger than the Pumos Union, though, because their operation is multinational. Even so, the Pumos Union was no pushover, and even offered mercenary services that the AG didn't typically bother with. There are a lot of areas in the UC that wouldn't have any sort of police if it weren't for Pumos, and the easiest way to become a guard is to join up with them. A gnome and an elf entered my office and bowed. The gnome is Malura Grinzaw, and she is the head of the Pumos Union. The elf is Yaraway Horfu, and he is the master of the Adventurers Guild. I gestured for them to take a seat, and they happily complied. There are 2 things we need to discuss, I said once they were settled. They subtly glanced at each other. I could imagine what they might think this meeting is about, and how nervous they both were. I had to fight a grin. First is the situation with the Night Kingdom invasion. I need mages that know how to ride a narse while casting. They will be pressed into service for the remainder of the invasion, but they will be well compensated for their efforts. Eyes widened and eyebrows shot up. It had been decades since adventurers had been drafted, and my willingness to impose upon their freedoms indicated a dire situation. Malura opened her mouth to say something, but quickly closed it again. It will be done, High Chief, Yaraway said. So the rumors are true, then? I don't know what the rumors are, so I cannot say, I replied. What I can say is that the Drow are using tactics that we are ill-prepared to respond to, and they invaded Blurpus instead of Yurna. We are planning on utilizing a mage cavalry force to tip things in our favor. Mounted mages. I'll be damned, Malura said. The second thing we need to discuss is the possibility of a school for study of magic. It will be an academic institution dedicated to instructing mages on the magical arts, both to further the common knowledge of magic as well as to bolster the caliber of our mages. Funding will be done through a mixture of government subsidies and tuition, with tuition waivers offered for completion of military service. The 2 guild leaders maintained their shocked expressions. Whatever they had thought this meeting to be about, I was demolishing their expectations. Malura recovered first this time. How can we help, High Chief? She asked. I need teachers and administrators that are well-versed in magic. It is unclear how many we will need as of yet, so I want you to make a list of those who are qualified and who may be interested. You said government subsidy, High Chief? How will the chiefdom be getting the funds necessary to start this Academy of Magic? Yaraway asked. Oh, that's quite simple, I said as a malicious grin spread across my features. I'll just be needing you to pay a bit more of your fair share of taxes. Some estimates put your payments at around 30% of what you should actually be paying. If you bump that up to 40%, we'll be able to afford the academy and I won't have to send the auditors. Their stunned silence was music to my ears.